Yes, welcome this evening to Race Treaty, where we discuss some issues from the human rights lens that are going on in the U.S. that we frame as civil rights violations, we frame as police brutality, we frame it as discrimination, but we don't frame it as human rights violations across the board, from mass incarceration to the extrajudicial police killings. They're actually categorized by law as human rights violations. In fact, the systemic process of killing black males fits into another definition also called democide, which is the extrajudicial killings of citizens by the government. So this evening, we're going to get into let me back up a little bit. We just got off a national conference call with Black Lives Matter, and I took a few notes, and there may still be in session. I took a few notes concerning the call-in, and basically, and this is a good thing, the call-in members were people engaged in direct action across the country. From St. Louis, they reported in from New York, L.A., Madison, Wisconsin, and South Carolina, which will be the focus of our conversation tonight, actually, this North Charleston murder. We're going to try to dissect that as a systemic analysis, not just an incident report, from the human rights lens, as we say. So in reference to Black Lives Matter, people are ready to get out and take direct action. That's a first step. We have to understand that, social change and people's movements function in layers and levels. And although I fully commend direct action, there has to be some systemic action surrounding this process of extrajudicial killings. And tonight, we're going to focus again on this recent slaying in North Charleston, and we're going to give some background to this particular officer, Officer Slanger, but we're also going to give some background from the framework of it wasn't just him, can't blame just him. It's a process concerning his co-workers, co-officers. It's a process concerning the headquarters that stymied the report of his lives for 4 days until the video came out where they had to speak up. It also shows some patterns of the history of this officer as relates to his over-aggressive violation of due process in the past. And we're going to play a clip, and then we're going to spin off our conversation off that clip. Scotty, can you go with that clip?
Now think about the mentality of a guy like Slager, who presumably initially was going to help this woman Brown, right? She's there saying, that's not him. You're attacking the wrong guy. And he's like, who gives a shit? What do I care? Wrong guy, right guy, they're all guilty. Let me stun him a couple of more times. Let me handcuff him. Let me arrest him. You had the person you were supposed to protect. That's not the guy. That's not the guy who threatened me. You got the wrong guy. I don't care. I got a black guy and I'm beating on him. What difference does it make? Gee, that guy wound up killing somebody else who was also an unarmed black man. Boy, I couldn't have seen that coming. And by the way, his cop partner there covered for him in that case. They saw him drop the taser in the Walter Scott case. We saw it all on video. He picked it up from one place, put it next to the dead body. Did the cops do anything about that? Did they report that? No, nothing. Nothing. Blue line. No. We all, cops protect each other no matter what. Doesn't matter how guilty they are. It doesn't matter how corrupt they are. It doesn't matter how many people they beat up, how many people they killed who are unarmed. It doesn't matter. But I'm told it's no. This is a rare exception. A few bad apples. Where are all the cops who, turned him in? None, right? And the cops did this investigation, and they decided, even after talking to this witness, who couldn't be clearer, no, not guilty, exonerated, go back on the streets and shoot someone. And in fact...
Yeah, so let's get right into it. Everyone's focusing on this officer. Okay, we caught him on the camera. This is not the first time that a video a capture of a snuff film. I mean, that's actually the new vogue is government snuff films. And so, given that, how does that weigh in the due process in the court of law? And also, how does that, in terms of the case, broaden the focus to the system that enabled this action? Well, you've got ex-vets, you've got mentally questionable, obviously, officers with histories, actually, documented histories of irregularities and violations of law that just laterally move into other police departments and continue to function, escalating to what we've observed in North Charleston. So the fact that there's a background to this, I like to bring into question the system. The co-workers, the EMT, emergency management team that arrives and set a medical satchel down next to the dead body or the dying body without anything else. And also, let's delve a little deeper yet. It don't really matter what color that these officers are. They're working for the status quo for the system. That makes them proxy racist. And analyzing that, we have to recognize that people function on the part of the system, the continuum of the system, in fact. So you've got a cover-up, you've got lies, you've got co-workers, you've got auxiliary agencies that are part of the process of emergency. All of that failed. All of that failed. In fact, it only failed, though, because we have a visual account, because they have put the mechanism that is repeated in this country in place. He felt threatened. The victim reached for his taser. He did what he had to do, basically, and the subsequent report covered it up and reinforced it. I really don't know what the account is of his co-workers, but it obviously should be made a record of.
I know, Robin, if you want me to tell you.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I saw on MSNBC, I'm not sure which show it was last night or the night before, but they shared the reports that was filled out by the other officers who were on scene and filled out reports, and one of them was like only 5 sentences long, and they were being criticized for that, but they were all telling the same story, the same lies. In fact, there was another officer that lied and said that they performed CPR on Mr. Scott. So, I mean, yes, the reports they did file those reports. You know, they filed the reports because it was only 4 days, it was 4 days later that we got the video, which now throws their reports into question like you was just talking about.
Right. Well, Scotty, all of this is a due process maze, ending up maybe in civil rights, but in terms of the criminal process, it's a maze. They're already setting the groundwork for letting this man up. In fact, basically all they have to do is pull the plug on the media coverage, and this case might not even come back to the surface for 1 or 2 or 3 years. And by that time, people's sensitivity and memory is dead into that. Of course, there'll be many more probably by that time, other instances. And meanwhile, you have, the fight back or the pushback to the white supremacy movement to criminalize or change legislation concerning cameras, concerning release police officers' names who are engaged in this kind of conduct. Basically, a total cover-up systemically. And this is what I want to bring back to focus here is the human rights framework. And I'm just going to read a brief summary of what really CERD and international law is and how that works in the U.S. It doesn't work. Actually, there is no human rights framework in the U.S. as of now. Because there is no national human rights infrastructure, many state, local officials are unaware of the treaties the U.S. has ratified, nor are there obligations with respect to treaty implementation. This lack of basic human rights education is compounded by resource and staffing constraints on the state and local level, which further impede the promotion and protection of human rights. state and local governments thus lack the capacity necessary to effectively collect and analyze data on human rights compliance and take other necessary steps to implement human rights. So in this whole framework, we're born with human rights. We've got international law that has us bound by ratified treaty to this human rights framework. We're on live. So the thing is that this is a global right that we all, as world citizens, are supposed to enjoy. Now, specific to the North Charleston, or let's just say the whole white supremacist structure is really based to neutralize this international law. In the face of discrimination and outright democide, the U.S. is not being held accountable. Now, referencing this past summer once again, wherein the U.S. was found in violation of U.S. ICER and other human rights violations, there is no accountability. And then this is a new experiment and some new idea. Oh, there is no federal records of all these extrajudicial police killings. There's no requirement that the national or federal government keep all the records. So you have this dispersed and disseminated information that's not aggregated to paint the real picture, and that's starting to come. So as relates to the framework of human rights, we have a gentleman that I'd like to just ask a few questions, a retired law enforcement, a black law enforcement officer, so happened to be from South Carolina, is familiar with the cultural nuances, if you will, wherein you have proxy racists or gentlemen who work for the government that might be of African American descent that really just are following the same mindset of culpability in terms of undermining due process and the blue line, which is basically undermining law, the cover-up. I'd like to introduce tonight a gentleman. I don't know if you want me to use your name or not. Retired officer James Long. And let me give you a little background on this gentleman. As I know him to be a professional in law enforcement, he's fully aware of the old boys club, as he calls it, but basically the structural racism that's embedded in these law enforcement agencies. He also understands the psychology of it, be it that he is himself what I would call a war hero, or he engaged in active combat with a high number of experiences for 18 years in the military. And then he laterally transferred into law enforcement. So he went into law enforcement looking at the local yokels a little differently, having come out of his own professional background. But Officer Long, we discussed, pull the chair up, man. We discussed, this focus on Officer Slanger. He got caught. It's on the camera. You immediately said, it ain't just him. Where's his deputy? Where's his co-worker? And his EMT? I'd like you to speak on that in terms of the system of being in this process, the blue line, the system, where if in fact that camera, when it came out, everybody was in concert with the same story, the system story.
Those are the type of situations that when stuff like that occurs, stuff like that is hidden. Stuff that's been going on like that for numerous of years. When you're talking about officer being charged with a homicide, something of that nature, you see what took place. He was trying to set the man up after he had been shot, and he tried to set him up with a taser. So that right there lets you know what kind of mindset he was doing.
Not only him, it would seem,
but his partner also. His partner came up was supposed to really perform CPR on the gentleman until the EMS arrived, but she didn't. Basically, the guy was shot 8 times and handcuffed, and nothing was done about it. So this is just something that's just been going on for a while. It's just not now.
Well, let's follow this through a little bit. Now, you just described what happened at that particular scene in terms of, okay, there's the extra police standing there with the bags, nothing being done. Okay, so they close accounts right then. They go back to the station and they start the reports. There were 4 days before this video came out where a report was being built by a group of people, I imagine. Is that not true? I mean, is it just Slanger who's going to write a report, or what about these other people saying they gave medical attention and this and that? I mean, how does that work?
Well, a situation like this, that's when everybody was supposed to write a report. You had some officers that were there, and basically, you know, if it had been videotaped, it had just been a lie.
So actually, not only a lie, Slanger's lie, but everybody that wrote a report joined in on that lie.
Exactly.
Are they now culpable in terms of a cover-up and the fact that they did lie contrary to the film?
Well, they did try to cover it up until the film came out. Whoever the gentleman was that brought the film to the family and let them know what actually took place, it would have just been a cover-up, a murder cover-up.
All right, we keep using this word cover-up, which kind of indicates that they threw Slanger under the bus. He's barricaded in his house. He's brought up on murder charges. Now we've redirected focus. I'd like to go back again to these first 4 days. These first 4 days where you got a list of officers, the chief is reviewing this incident, and they're all coming up with the same story. Okay? They're all coming up with the same story. So if that's the case, they're throwing him under the bus because no one's talking about the chief who had to see the incident report, the other witnesses that were on the scene of the crime who had to write an incident report. All of that is accumulative at that department. It's not just that officer who's now being brought up on murder charges. What about the system?
The system is just one of those things is where it's going to take a lot for the system to change, you know, especially with, you know, people of color constantly getting murdered by police officers all over the United States. So in a situation like this, everything has to be revised and looked at in different levels. So hopefully with the situation that took place in North Charleston, everything would hopefully work out for the family. I hope that they can get to the bottom of this situation. I hope that justice be served.
Well, in response to that, in the history of justice being served, because I really hold to the saying that racism cannot render justice. And as a result, I don't know that justice can be served. In fact, there's a quick clip that I'd like to end this half of the session, and then we'll go for a break. Scotty, can you play that second recording that came on today on the news in this gentleman's history of police murders and convictions, the likely result of really what we're looking at right now in North Charleston, with great concern and ready to mobilize. But in the end result, let's just play this clip.
Murder here, but we have not seen a conviction of a police officer, as far as I know, and I challenge your audience to find a case of a police officer being convicted of first-degree murder of a black, brown, or Native person in the entire history of this nation.
Scotty. Excuse me, Scotty?
Yeah,
Scotty
that was
Reed?
the other clip you gave me.
That's the right clip. I'm just curious about your response to that.
My response, I'm sure if we look through history, we can find, you know, Measurely was convicted of killing Oscar Grant. You know what I'm saying? So I just think that, you know, his memory just isn't serving him correctly. But it is a rare bird. It is a rare bird. So, you know, there have been times when cops have been convicted for killing people, but, you know, it's just a rare bird, and it depends on many variables and dynamics, like race of the cop, race of the victim, you know, makeup of the jury, You know, it just depends. So many variables, but he's incorrect to say that no white cop has ever been convicted of killing a non-white person. That's not true.
We're going to bring this subject back up in the framework of the legal process in this country and its history. We're going to take that break now, Scotty, if we can.
Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Okay, we're back. You know, we're kind of ad-libbing this. I'm really like hyped up about this killing being captured on film, but the implications is the insight into the system. Perhaps I'm fixated with the fact that this is a human rights violation. It's not an incident that fits a pattern of human rights violations, and that in fact there are mechanisms, being set up to bring these issues into the international arena. Getting back to CERD, it protects us, but there's no enforcement mechanisms until we can bring these issues as human rights violations to international courts. Now, the issue of human rights versus civil rights is something that's about to come to a head, I do believe, in the sense that there's a new finding and new language that's being used finally, acceptance into public parlance, and that is implicit bias. In a way, it's a lateral excuse, if you will, to cover up what has been behavioral prejudice and racism. And you actually are letting, similar to corporations and their personhood, you're saying these institutions that engage in implicit bias are basically off the hook and we can make maybe some kind of reform or adjustment. From my perspective, I think that falling in alignment with the competencies surrounding international laws that we are compelled to comply with would involve the restructuring of institutions. I'm going to give a quick political analysis of Ferguson as an example. You have Ferguson now with a higher population represented in the city council. If that city council enacted CERD, the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, it would encompass not only the corporations and the federal government, state government, and civil society as well. Because you have a lot of nonprofits, and I'm going to direct focus on human rights agencies, that get a lot of money to perform a mission, usually based on a linguistic code as relates to dealing with peoples of color or otherwise. They use language like target group, at-risk population. There are other jingles that they use, and they garner the money to service this particular group. Self-identified as African Americans, descendants of African American slavery, people of color, and otherwise oppressed communities. And they garner the infrastructure and the institutions with their built-in implicit bias to conduct services. So there's this framework in referencing human rights that, again, Malcolm X was really adamant about in understanding that this legal framework, you must be reminded, I guess, started out with classifying so-called African Americans as 3/5 humans. So through the process of continuous legislative and amendments and documentation, utilizing new terms, that's neologism, controlling the narrative, they've continued to define our experience here in this country. Rather than self-determined and self-defined and with a voice on the international arena, we've been compelled through the civil rights framework to air our lamentations and proving intent on the part of the system of white supremacy to discriminate and keep us lowly intergenerationally in perpetuity. So getting back again to the framework of CERD. CERD guarantees the right of everyone, without distinction as to race, to equal protection under the law. State parties to CERD treaty must take affirmative action to eliminate racial discrimination in all of its forms and to review, amend, or nullify laws or practices that have purpose or effect of discriminating on the basis of race. That's Article 2 of CERD, which also underlies the role of the agencies of the U.S. government to comply with CERD. However, in comparison to CERD and other international standards, the U.S. law offers a much more restrictive conception of racial discrimination. For example, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits state governments from engaging in discriminatory practices. However, long-standing constitutional jurisprudence has established that evidence of a disparate racial impact associated with facial neutral provision, implicit bias, or policy is insufficient to establish discrimination, absent additional evidence of discriminatory intent. That's technology. So you have, on the one hand, implicit bias, the subconscious levels of basically race prejudice, housed in other psychological terms. You can have white privilege, you can have internalized superiority, you can have racism denial, you got the kumbaya, we're all human, and, you know, there's the counter arguments to a definitive universal definition as to what racism is systemically. And so that's been problematic as well in the terms of universalizing definitions. And, excuse me, we spun off with last week with the sciences, social science, psychology, sociology, and the implications for law to adjust to new knowledge. I mean, law is allegedly based on facts, a tier of facts, so why not bring in the higher science of today rather than these antiquated systems like 3/5 human and the exception technology in the 13th Amendment, the subterfuge of the 14th Amendment, wherein you really gave birth to an invisible being filled with all control and power, without any humans involved in the terms of any moral or ethical commitments. And I'm talking about corporations. There are like 138 cases that came out of the 14th Amendment empowering corporations, whereas with the so-called free slaves really was a compounded adjustment to the definition of slavery and the involuntary versus voluntary slavery systems that they set up. So again, this issue in North Charleston could set a precedent. It wouldn't be a precedent of a videotaped snuff film by the police. We've seen plenty of them of late. Perhaps they're taking a damage control. It seems like classic public relations, but they're putting the man under the bus and redirecting the focus that they all participated in that 4-day cover-up in the compounding of a story that was fabricated, a lie, which is illegal too, by the way, in all of this, right? And so everybody that made a report that lied should be culpable, unveiling the process. And that's probably should be going up to the mayor or the chief of police as well. And I'm curious to find out how that plays out in these coming weeks as well. Now, referencing Black Lives Matter, you know, I mean, you think national, think global, act local. And there are so many schisms in our programming as people of color, African Americans, Black, that, you know, you have a lack of support, in my opinion, for this movement to embrace a different way of addressing systemic racism. And we're making progress, in my view, in that we're bringing in new terminology and maybe working towards codifying it, making it, you know, socially and legally acceptable. And I'm talking about this implicit bias phase and explanation, which kind of opens up the door to the whole total neurosis and pathology of white supremacy. And we hope in this coming weeks to kind of elucidate a little more on the human rights law, the path that can be taken from local to international in the vein of human rights. All right, there you go. Can we take another break, Scotty? There's more. I have company tonight, so really kind of ad-lib, but really wanted to discuss more about this process with law enforcement and how we have a tendency in reaction and response to the media to focus directly in on the individuals and the incident and event, even though there's a pattern or a system behind the event. In this instance, you have a 4-day delay of reports being generated and a fixed story for the public that was undermined in one event with that video. So they had no choice but to throw the man under the bus. But in our little second clip today, you might argue the point, but I'm not sure that I'm familiar with any history of the police being convicted or the murder of the victim, especially behind a tail light. We're going to take a break now. I'll be right back.
This is Brother Elliot, host of Time for an Awakening, and you're listening to Black Talk Radio Network, new media for the new millennium.
We see our people being brutalized by white bigots, white racists. We think that they are foolish to allow themselves to be beaten and brutalized and do nothing whatsoever to protect themselves. They are foolish. They should have the right to defend themselves against any attack made against them by anyone. If a dog is biting a black man, the black man should kill the dog. Whether the dog is a police dog, a hound dog, or any kind of dog. If a dog is fixed on a black man, when that black man is doing nothing but trying to take advantage of what the government says is supposed to be his, then that black man should kill that dog or any two-legged dog. I think you'll find, sir, that there will come a time when black people wake up and become intellectually independent enough to think for themselves, as other humans are intellectually independent enough to think for themselves. Then the black man will think like a black man, and he will feel for other black people. And this new thinking and feeling will cause black people to stick together. And then at that point, you'll have a situation where when you attack one black man, you are attacking all black men. And this type of black thinking will cause all black people to stick together. And this type of thinking also will bring an end to the brutality inflicted upon black people by white people. And it is the only thing that will bring an end to it. No federal court, state court, or city court will bring an end to it. It's something that the black man has to bring an end to, has to bring an end to, has to bring an end to.
The beginning of wisdom, using the right words. This is a definition check. Extrajudicial execution is a euphemism for murder. More specifically, extrajudicial execution is when the state kills someone without proper due process. This can either be by the direct agents of the state, such as the military or police, or indirectly by private citizens whom the state elects not to punish for its action. This presupposes that the private citizen does not have an affirmative defense that would hold up in the state's court. However, extrajudicial executions are almost universally considered a human rights violation. However, many states continue the practice either in secret or else justifying it as necessary. The most common justification is that the state is in a state of emergency and the killings are necessary because of the judiciary is weak, slow, or corrupt. These excuses are disregarded by human rights organizations in almost all cases. So extrajudicial executions are the most often practiced in countries where leaders are of a state, have a state authoritarian leaning. So in the human rights framework, you can very readily see our daily headlines, our announcements of human rights violations. From the school to prison pipeline to 13th Amendment issues, the extrajudicial killings. The system is starting to be unveiled in referencing the DA offices in conjunction with judges. I mean, the whole system is guilty of violation of international law. So where do you go to obtain accountability for all these human rights violations? Well, the way they have it set up internally in the U.S. basically is that there's really no strong, and there is no, with the exception of some brethren, Dr. Ansari being the one, black human rights movements. Now, there's a lot who take on the name human rights, and if you look into them a little deeper, they're either directly connected with animal rights or environment or LGBT, not to downplay intersectionality, but the issue of systemic racism is not really being embraced into the law. And so you have these words in the third law that really promise more in the terms of human rights against discrimination than the civil rights, much less the 3/5 of human constitution original language. And so we know that it's not for us. We're global citizens, and while everybody downplays the UN, really the majority of countries there are of color, and all have experienced the same spectrum of oppression by the Western Front. And we've just been programmed. We've been programmed through monoculture and assimilation, where we've really lost our own moral compass. You know, having come from descendants of slaves or the descendants, what's few left, First Nations from genocide, now just land and their food and the buffalo, and the environment continues. The onslaught against the environment continues for First Nations. So how do you embrace this double mindset, this what Frantz Fanon calls cognitive dissonance? How do we deprogram? Because it feels like we can't make this bridge from the civil rights mentality as long as, I guess, MSNBC or whatever the name of it has, Sharpton mouthing, or people, the public media still covering Jesse Jackson or other so-called leaders in the civil rights, trying to keep it framed in the civil rights where nothing but reports are taking place. No legal action for violation of human rights. So, we've got a ways to go, I think, in this Black Lives Matter. Direct actions, I'm down with it. It has a point. There has to be an infrastructure overhaul as a follow-up. And, I'm closely following Ferguson and very prayerful that this is going to take place there. The irony about St. Louis is, if they were to take that city council and enact these international laws in reinforcement of the U.S. signing, they would automatically have Monsanto in its headquarters right there in St. Louis under a whole other legal framework immediately. There's some irony about this human rights law that enabled Canadians to come across the bridge to help brothers and sisters in Detroit with their water shut off. They didn't have an infrastructure set up in this metropolis, a human rights infrastructure, a conduit to the UN for human rights violations. It took a Canadian neighbor to come across the bridge to do that, because there's no national human rights infrastructure dealing with CERD and the main four conventions, torture and otherwise. And so we're going to keep beating this drum about the race treaty that the U.S. signed, ratified, and basically neutralized, while they have us in a brain lock of a civil rights framework that is not really resulting in any progress for us as a people. I think African Americans are the only people, so-called citizens, that have to basically reapply and renegotiate voting rights every 20 years or so. I mean, something's wrong. And while everybody associates the UN, I agree that they don't have the greatest track record, but then they have not been populated by our leadership and our potential organizing on the international level. We just haven't entered in there. We've been on the periphery with nonprofits and few organizations, Pan-African otherwise, but we really haven't engaged the UN as a voice, because they've got the social engineering thing going on with African Americans that, we liable to be called something else next year. And they've done about 4 or 5 times in my lifetime. And I say they because I still haven't been able to identify the actual personalities in the census process. Yeah, I guess we have a call coming in, or
no, that's me. I have a question.
Sure, brother.
I have a question in terms of human rights. Let me give you some background. Now, we have heard, I don't know about the framework, maybe you can tell us, but remember, when in France, and I think even in Germany, we were hearing news reports about George Bush and Dick Cheney being indicted in these countries, and that, if they fly to these countries, that they subject to being arrested. Now, I don't know if this was the French government, the German government, or some, non-governmental organization that did this. But in terms of slavery and abolitionism here in America, which we're trying to make a big part of this upcoming presidential election season, injecting abolition into it, and the fact that the United States practices human rights violations, specifically slavery, and which Venezuela recently asked them to repeal the 13th Amendment because it allows for slavery as punishment for crime. So, but we know that the UN Declaration of Human Rights does abolish slavery in all its forms, is the language that it uses. So I had a question among, that I was floating around and discussing with other abolitionists, and we were asking, okay, if indeed, foreign countries under international law can issue indictments for, war crimes or whatever as it pertains to George Bush or Dick Cheney, how come we can't go after the CEOs and corporate officers and board of directors of those individuals who sit on the boards of like private prison corporations that we know are engaged in prison slavery? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't believe that you can get to the corporations through national federal law. The federal law is what birthed corporations, gave them life, and protects them. In fact, now has given them, there's a civil rights movement for corporations.
No, well, I'm talking about under international law.
International law, I've heard strategies wherein these multinational corporations can be sued in international courts from other locations as well.
But I'm not talking about suing, but that's a great option. But I'm talking about actually indicting them for practicing slavery.
I would say that's a case in the foundation of what corporations are, going back to shadow slavery, and banks being and insurance companies developing out of the industry of slavery. And so those are crimes against humanity that still haven't been addressed in the reparations form, So I would say that you have a good question, and I would say that we have a 10-year decade for the descendants of African American slaves and their experiences. And I would say that that because of sovereignty, international law cannot disrupt the basic foundations of this Constitution. It has to be internal. And so there's an amendment issue going on. But you know what? I think that you have a point. Under the crimes against humanity and human rights laws, that corporations should be sued.
But I'm not talking about suing. I'm talking about actually arresting corporate officers for crimes. I mean, if a
I hear what you're saying. In fact, that really does apply to Bush and war criminals.
Right, that's a corporation. They were just simply officers of the U.S. corporation, right?
Well, arresting them is an act. So you would already have to fold them from the arrest. Is that part of the due process that brings them into the criminal or civil law system that is already the mechanism which we function under in this country? Where do you go from after arresting them? Where do you take them? And what jurisdiction are they under? Now, if you're talking international, that's a whole nother story as to how that could happen. I wish I had, and I'm going to bear a study on it, how that could possibly work,
Thank you for considering the question.
Yes, thank you for bringing it up. Good question. There's been a few movies out, Spook Set by the Door, Drop Squad, blah, blah, blah. But the inference is deprogramming is in order. You got 400 years of a Willie Lynch syndrome going on. Deprogramming is in order. When you assimilate, you lose your own identity. Everything is framed around what we're told it's framed around. Not what's necessarily right, legal, ethical, or moral. And we're at that apex now in terms of the empowerment of corporations in the political process, fascism. Capitalism is all about material things. It's not about compassionate use of accumulated wealth. It's about hoarding that and severing into class. And, that's kind of my emphasis behind the racism fixation is like, well, there's not really going to be no global, there's not going to be no Occupy 99%. I was checking that all the way through because they would not deal with racial justice issues. Until that acknowledgement and the dismantling of white supremacy is being undertaken systemically, then we're going by their narrative. you know, and when the laws are set up against you and everyone's just playing stupid for all the scientific minds and the intellect of Western man to not process the issue of intent to discriminate in the legal structure, when there's already built-in bias, implicit bias, that there's records of disparity in all areas of people activity as relates to racism and discrimination, which just shows a window of a system, white supremacy, illegal, immoral. So I would say, you know, in terms of holding corporations, they're part of the bigger system of white supremacy. They're the institutional bedrock of it, you know, infused by, you know, 400 years of free labor, basically, capitalism. So I relate, you know, this is what the Occupy thing really used to get to me, was like, okay, you worried about the Occupy of the Wall Street, but literally underneath Wall Street is 20,000 bones of African Americans that are buried under Wall Street. You know, that corporations got their identity and power as a being, a living entity, under the 14th Amendment. And then civil rights, that didn't come out of constitutional law. That comes out of I forgot the term, but it's not directly out of any social or constitutional law. And yet we're locked in the framework of civil rights as our answer. Really, basically, it's a payoff. You know, it's like find a bad guy, sue him, get a little fanfare, and then there's a money exchange for these killings. You know, the victim's family gets money, and the perpetrator, you know, they already started this Stringer's guy's defense. I think GoFundMe knocked him out, and Indiegogo let him keep it to start raising money in his defense. So that process, generating revenue off the incident of killing a black body, continues as well. And, you know, in referencing international law, there's an international web in the system of white supremacy. You have international industry going on, the black market industry of human body parts that nobody wants to talk about, just like no one wants to talk about. What unfortunately came out of the source of The Guardian in England, I caught it a few years ago, of 64,000 black women missing in this country. You don't hear about it in the press in this country. It's been repeated and echoed, but it came out of an investigation from another country about this, what's going on in the U.S. So, you know, we have a lot more than incidents that kind of take the brain and focus it on one particular item. This is how they effectuate, you know, the mind control, if you will, in terms of the media and the scientific techniques used, you know, to basically control or develop opinions on the people in mass. And behind the scenes, there are a lot of realities. I mean, every time I say 64,000 black women in this country are missing, it's hard to wrap my mind around it. Even more so, the fact that this is an apparent human rights violation that is getting no wind, no air, no thoughts, not enough prayer. And that includes the Aboriginal women in Canada that are suffering another same type of dynamic of disappearance of the female bodies. And this is not like science, you know, conspiracy or tin hat. This is a reality as we focus in on incidents which, because of technology, are being revealed, but are happening and have always happened every day, or I should say every day in 2 hours or 4 hours or 28 hours. So human rights versus civil rights. Now, I welcome the audience as you follow this process in North Charleston. Let's time it and see how soon it dies out in the public media. Secondly, how we can, with our Human Rights Monitor access, follow this process of the internal investigation, because this whole thing started out with a lie in a concerted, fabricated way, systemic. And we just want to focus on this one cop. I say let's focus on the system. The system is what's corrupt. So let's take that challenge to look at things in the way of a system. And that includes the slavery issue, man. The language is coined inside a system. I mean, and I don't think you need to prove intent that they were building a white supremacist system based on privileges for people of European descent, period. No apologies. And everything subsequent to that has proved that. And as far as I know, this gentleman that was on the radio today made a point of fact, and that is I have never heard of a conviction of law enforcement for the killing of African American, Latino, black, brown, red, or yellow folks. It ain't happening. So while we do all this fanfare and these emotional roller coaster of the headlines, let's follow this through and see it for what it is, a system of white supremacy. Good night, folks. We're going to end early tonight, man.